Welcome to Responding to Human Trafficking for Pregnancy Resource Centers. This is Module 5, and today we'll look at tactics traffickers use. After completing this module, you'll be able to describe common grooming tactics, explain how mental and emotional manipulation breaks down barriers, understand the seasoning process, attribute tactics to specific trafficker archetypes, ask questions to expose problematic behaviors. Victims don't usually know they're victims, but your client might. Even so, she probably won't self-identify. She may have been brainwashed, or she may not know what to call it. Traffickers will move in on a person's felt need. If she's poor, they'll flaunt money and entice her with gifts or a job that promises wealth. If she's from a broken home, they'll offer stability and a hope for a forever future. If she's wealthy and strong, but lonely and sheltered, they'll offer adventure and unconditional love. Of course, none of this is true, but traffickers are master manipulators. The general pattern for grooming a person for abuse is to find any vulnerability and exploit it. The process usually involves isolation and gaslighting, which involves manipulating them to the point of questioning their own sanity, degrading their self-worth. Victims begin to accept what would previously be unacceptable. Grooming for labor trafficking might include instilling the dream of a better life, one of ease and possibly leisure, or in which intense social pressure to help support family members may be fulfilled. There may be violence from within or outside of her social circle. Young women who are domestic servants, seasonal farm labor, or similar servitude by force, fraud, or coercion do exist in the U.S. You might see them in your center. Grooming for sex trafficking is a subtle psychological game that includes developing bonds, breaking down defenses, and diminishing self-worth. Over time, grooming becomes more intense and attached to requirements, such as performing sex acts the victim's not comfortable with, committing some petty crime, or giving the pimp something of value as a way of testing loyalty. Romeo or finesse pimps work with tremendous intentionality to learn what her vulnerabilities are. This can take time, but pimps often have a queue of girls. She may have no idea that he has prostituted girls like her who have given him the money to buy her gifts, fully intending to continue the same cycle. The internet is a tool, for good or for bad. For example, online learning can help you better serve your clients, but traffickers use the internet to track and capture their prey. They may pose as a peer to interact and exploit vulnerabilities to develop their plan. A pimp or bottom may use a social media account to discover vulnerable youth. For example, a girl posts that she wants a tattoo on Facebook. A pimp might tell her that he'll do it for free. They'll find a convincing ploy. After the tattoo, she owes him. It might not even be the design she wanted, or it could be his insignia, and now he owns her. Social media check-ins are also a way for predators to find prey. They'll track her and show up where she is and begin the grooming process. Traffickers find their victims in neighborhoods, at the mall, at the beach, in bowling alleys, at schools and parks, and anywhere people gather. The first pimp that sold me hung around the neighborhood where I lived, pretending to look for a friend. He was jovial to all the kids. I had no idea I was his target. This is so easy with GPS-enabled apps like Friend Finder, Kik, Yak, and the very popular Snapchat. The apps allow anyone to locate others who also have the app in real time. Youth are easy prey for cunning online predators who will use any means necessary to get their attention and draw them into their clever traps. It's terrifying, really. With GPS-enabled apps, a trafficker may monitor a naive girl's phone so they can convince her that they just happened to run into her, taking on an exciting persona of someone she's meant to be with. By anonymously tracking her social media accounts, a trafficker can also take on a scary omnipresence. They might reveal that they know she was with a certain friend or that they saw her doing some innocuous activity. It may start out as a fun game, but when she's convinced that the trafficker knows everything and is everywhere, she will believe that she has nowhere to escape when things start to go bad. Online grooming is so pervasive that whole agencies have been organized to tackle the problem. Your state's Internet Crimes Against Children, or ICAC office, will be one of the important contacts to include in your center's protocols. Online grooming tactics may either lead to trafficking by continuing the grooming process in person, or tactics may be the means to online remote sex trafficking, or it may lead to a first contact of abduction and rape. This is so dangerous that some states mandate internet safety classes in schools. As subtle as grooming can be, it can happen quickly with a victim who has already experienced trauma as a child. The core violation of child sexual abuse is particularly easy for a savvy exploiter to spot. The business of degrading people is demonic in nature. Romeo pimps retain power over their victims by constantly testing which boundaries they can cross. Violence is not absent in grooming, but it may be rare. Often, the threat is as subtle as the manipulation. Pimps are usually very intelligent and exceedingly charming. She may have no idea she's being manipulated at first. The trafficker could be a man or a woman, pretending to be a savior of sorts, or a much-needed friend in time of trouble. They will draw her into a relationship the same way a domestic abuser does, and then begin the cycle of abuse. As the relationship progresses, seeds of self-doubt are planted. The trafficker might target her appearance and make her believe that she's unlovely to others, and that they are the only one who could want her. They might target her lack of knowledge, playing on anything that could be considered an imperfection as a reason no one else could ever want her. They might even employ the help of others to keep the charade going. She will become more dependent on the exploiter and look to them for validation and direction. It may seem absurd to a person in healthy relationships, but grooming can be very powerful, especially in our overstimulated, oversexualized, overly superficial culture. It works to break down barriers that a victim may have in place to protect herself both physically and emotionally. If she is very attractive, a clever trafficker might exploit her by telling her she's too beautiful not to share. They might call her high-end, or dress her up to be an escort to the wealthy. If she believes she is the one person the trafficker needs and loves, she'll keep betraying herself, little by little, until she withdraws from her friends and family and from activities. As her time is consumed with pleasing her exploiter, she becomes less and less able to distinguish between her past and her present, and she begins to lose sight of any other future. There is always a very powerful downside to the slightest noncompliance, whether it's fear of violence, abandonment, withholding basic needs, drugs, or other punishments. Power over victims is the whole intent. Sometimes this cannot be done with subtlety. At times, guerrilla pimps are called in, or a combination of tactics are used. This is called seasoning or breaking. Seasoning involves violence. Traffickers will deprive her of basic needs and use multiple forms of torture. She will be isolated from any support and bombarded with a combination of psychological and physical trauma. They will deny her sleep and food. They may give her drugs or deny them to increase the pain of the beatings, withdrawal, gnawing hunger, and gang rape. They might record or photograph the process for extortion and blackmail. Seasoning is designed to break down any resistance and ensure complete compliance. The sleep deprivation and constant severe violence could take place over a period of days, weeks, or months. Suffering such intense trauma, she may have no concept of time. Seasoning may also involve threats to loved ones. The victim's child or children may be taken hostage. The level of psychological and physical trauma inflicted is whatever it takes. Depending on the geographic area, a woman sold for prostitution could be worth many tens of thousands of dollars per year to her exploiter. Once control is established, whether by grooming or seasoning, pimps will often brand victims by tattooing or scarring them to let them and anyone else know who's in control. Drugs and alcohol use are common among trafficking victims, although not universal. The intensity of the psychological and physical pain is temporarily eased with substances. Many pimps will introduce drugs as a means of control. Some pimps will require a full accounting of every penny. If she spends any money on food or other needs, the pimp or bottom will require receipts. She may barter or steal if she has to make up the difference. If this is familial trafficking, she is often trafficked out of her own home. The intense betrayal will impact her ability to trust and make decisions. She may be at your center with a family member who groomed her early. Always look for opportunities to talk with her alone. The tactics used to control victims define the archetypes of traffickers. Among labor traffickers, coyotes are generally more violent and ruthless, and snakeheads may be more manipulative and cunning. As you've learned in sex trafficking, gorilla pimps control their victims entirely or nearly entirely by physical violence. They thrive on upholding a reputation to be feared, although they might use the word respect. They often equate violence with power and money with authority. Romeo or finesse pimps will use psychological means to manipulate victims into compliance and loyalty. Pimping is sometimes a family business. A father may teach his son or fatherless nephew. So daddy pimps will use the pretense of family duty to force victims into prostitution. The way each person responds to the trauma of trafficking is as individual as our fingerprints. Some people are led without any violence, but most will experience violence at some point, either from the trafficker or from a buyer. There are people in the sex trade who say that they have never experienced violence. One told me, never in 30 years. But that same person practiced as a dominatrix, so her paradigm was one of sadomasochism, or inflicting pain during sex. Her response to sexual violence is substantially different from what another person's would be. Ultimately, violence is intrinsic to all forms of human trafficking. Forcing a person to work against their will, with or without beatings, is abuse too. The same questions you ask about domestic violence can draw out trafficking situations. If her relationship has changed recently, what kind of changes were there? Did he start out as a perfect match, only to turn into a badgering bully? You probably wouldn't use those exact words. As you're talking and discussing if he's ever hurt her, ask her if he says things to make her feel crazy. Does he say things didn't happen that she sure did, or does he constantly insist that she remembers events incorrectly? Does he tell her that she's forgotten conversations all the time? Does their relationship seem like a cycle of very high highs and terribly low lows? Does he force her to do things she doesn't want to do? These same questions can apply to labor trafficking. By asking her in a safe place, you may give her the freedom she needs to think about what's going on. Because grooming is usually a subtle seduction that leads to strong loyalties, we must not intrude on that relationship. Our approach to open victims' eyes needs to be subtle also. A strong rapport is the most important way to help her recognize abuse. Trauma bonds will cause her to actually be more bound to her trafficker if she thinks we are attacking him. Exemplifying loving commitment and being a faithful confidant will go much further than exposing red flags and waving them in front of her. Of course, there is the risk of her not returning. People need people. That's why your center exists. We know providing clients with social and emotional support is just as important as any material or educational goals. Pimps and traffickers are dangerous. Your client's safety and her long-term connection with you are both considerations when handling any potential situation. As previously mentioned, victims of human trafficking usually don't self-identify as victims, so they're not looking to be rescued. Gently revealing indicators to them might help them seek freedom.